Let me put this in words you might understand. Mr. President, off.
Hi again, everybody. It's now 5 o'clock in New York. One of those freeze-frame, record-scratch moments. You're probably wondering how we got here, as the old saying goes, when those are the first words from the mouth of a Danish representative to the European Parliament, a far-right one at that. Denmark, remember, lost more soldiers per capita in Afghanistan than the nation responsible for invoking Article 5 as part of that conflict in the first place. The nation it jumped to defend. The nation now threatening the sovereignty of its territory in Greenland. Yes, us, the United States of America. As we speak, our NATO allies who stood with us shoulder to shoulder in our hour of crisis and tragedy and need are grappling with hypotheticals, scenarios they never dreamed of in their darkest nightmares. Things they never thought they'd be forced to address and plan for. Sadly, they have that in common with American military leadership. As Tom Nichols writes in The Atlantic today, quote, American officers know what Trump is planning. The world knows it because Trump won't stop saying it. And their minds will rebel at directives to take everything they've prepared to do for years and apply it backwards against the people they have trained to work with and protect. The president, in other words, will be ordering them to do something they have been trained never to do. Should Donald Trump pursue this scheme of conquest, the military's training will have to be shattered and reassembled into a destructive version of itself, as if doctors were asked to take life-saving medicines, reconstitute them as poisonous isomers, and then administer them to patients. A former senior NATO and Pentagon official tells MS Now this, quote, any move touching Danish territory would immediately be framed as an alliance matter, pushing coordination through NATO, with the EU reinforcing the political and economic dimensions. And so, our revered and beloved servicemen and women up and down the chain of command may soon be forced to reckon with what would be an historic betrayal of our very closest allies and friends, all in service of what Donald Trump describes as his own psychological need. Quote, that is where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends, the aforementioned staff writer at The Atlantic, a contributor to the Atlantic Daily Newsletter. Tom Nichols is here. He's a professor emeritus of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College, where he taught for more than 2 decades. Also joining us, Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. He served as the commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe. Tom, I think you flesh out in really disturbing ways what people who have covered this and understand to be the case. We would be at war with our allies, but you describe what that means for the men and women of the military. And I'm going to ask both of you to take me through what that means and what that looks like. But Tom, you write about it, so tell me more.
They would have to basically decide that everything that they've done was pointed in the wrong direction. That after years of training with our allies, with the Danes, to fight against foreign threats, outside threats to Europe, to Denmark, to the North Atlantic community, of which we are all a part, to the United States, that we would have to stop all of that, turn around, and literally do everything backwards and say, now the Danes are the enemy. We have to invade their territory in the way that we once assumed someone else would do that. And I think, it's a shocking level of betrayal that we're asking our men and women in uniform to do. And, while it's an honor to be here with Mark, I'm just stunned at the silence of so many generals and admirals, active duty and retired, who know this and who know it better than anyone about what a kind of, mental and emotional reversal this would be for people that have trained never to do the thing that they're going to be ordered to do.
General Hertling.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Tom said, is that when you're talking about Europe, which I spent about a third of my career in Europe and working with allies across the board, there are 49 different countries in Europe. 31 of them are part of the NATO alliance with us and Canada, so that's 32. And what I'd say is, my last year in command in 2013, Nicole, we did 435 multinational exercises of different types. So sometimes we would go with 5 countries, sometimes we would go with 10, sometimes it was just a one-on-one with another country. So Tom is exactly right. We have developed friendships, training, and exercised with these individual nations, with their armies. We know their governments. We know both their strengths and some of their weaknesses. But this is just insane from the standpoint of what you're asking the military to potentially do against allied nations that are part of a security alliance that dates back to 1947. And I'd add to that, one of the factors in that security alliance is the fact that President Truman was one of the instigators of NATO. He signed the original document. And then a couple of months later, the Senate approved it by a vote of something like 86-13. So when you're talking about what the military might be asked to do, it would not only violate international law, invading another country, the sovereignty of another country, it would also violate domestic law. And this would be something that all military officers who swear the oath to the Constitution would have to question and would have to get legal advice on. But truthfully, I'll tell you, I wouldn't need any legal advice. I would say it's illegal to violate the oath and attack an alliance nation unless some things have changed. And it doesn't appear anything has changed because Mr. Trump is playing ad hocism like he does quite a bit.
Well, I think you've pushed open a door that we cover here all the time in the menacing harassment, now criminal investigation from DOJ and the FBI and for Senator Kelly from the Pentagon of the 6 lawmakers who told the men and women of the military never to follow an illegal order. I mean, are you saying, General Hertling, that if they were asked to, I can't get the words out of my mouth, attack Greenland, that would be an illegal order?
Well, if it were to happen tomorrow, then yes, because Greenland by statute is part of Denmark, which is an allied nation, part of the 32 members of NATO. So you brought up at the top of the show about how it would institute a dynamic within the NATO headquarters where, you know, the key questions of both Article 4 and Article 5 is, do you have to be protected from some type of foreign invasion if you're a member of NATO? And do you come together in Brussels to debate that? So any nation that might be attacked, in this case Denmark, one of their outlying islands, has been attacked. So they would immediately go to NATO headquarters and say, let's invoke those articles that NATO is so famous for. So yeah, it would be illegal, in my view, to do that. Now, I'm not a lawyer or an international affairs guru in terms of the legal implications of something like that. But I got to tell you, Nicole, if I was in command of a large organization and was asked to do that, I certainly would throw the question down. Tom was baiting me a minute ago. He knows to do that very well, saying, where are the rest of the military guys standing up to say this? Well, some of them will stand up, and there have been several that have already retired. You're never going to see the active duty guys say this, but I'm hoping that they are fighting behind the scenes to say, we can't do this. Mr. President, this is wrong. And that's the kind of thing we saw in the first administration when General Milley and General Kelly and Secretary Esper were all telling him he could not do the kinds of things he wanted to do.
Well, and a lot of what Milley and Esper were telling him not to do, he's steamrolled through and done in this second term before the 1-year anniversary since his second inauguration.